we didn't do it. We had to start the meeting a little different than we wanted to, but that's okay. I wanted to meet in person, see you guys' faces, but well, what can I say? It didn't happen. Please mute, if you would, please. I think everybody is, looks like. Do we have any guests here? How about new members?
New member, Pat Hogan.
All right, talk to me, Pat. What do you know?
I'm a beginning fly fisherman. Looking forward to learning more, looking forward to getting better with my casting. I purchased a Reddington rod, I don't know, a year or so ago. I don't know if you know Dick Ryan, a good friend of mine. We've done quite a bit of fishing for bluegill and things like that, and I'm looking to move into the trout world.
Well, welcome. We'll help you any way we can. Sounds like you already got a buddy. So you've already got a buddy, right? Helping you out.
I'm looking forward to meeting all of you in person. I was disappointed about the meeting tonight. I couldn't get there. So, but I do appreciate all this information.
Well, we will be meeting at purpose too. April the 2nd for our all-day meeting, and you'll
Great.
get the information about that. So
I appreciate it.
any other new members? Okay, Jacob, what's going on in the web world?
Not a ton. Anybody has any good fishing pictures or stories, please send them my way and I'll get them on the newsletter. Yeah, not too much. Augie, I will go ahead and make you the presenter here if you have any slides you're going to share. I think that's probably the easiest way. I don't know. I think we have to do a couple more reports before that, but that's how we'll handle it though.
Okay.
Back to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you much, Jacob. Steve Lekich, we got any money?
Yeah, it's all in pennies, but yeah. The books are balanced. We came up with a budget. We're going to be probably running a deficit of about almost $5,000 this year based on our expenses and our incomes. Good news is people have started paying up their dues for 2022, which was nice to finally get some income in for change. I don't know if Alex is going to make it or not, but I think the last time he and I talked, and you talked, Dan, we're probably right at about like 120 plus or minus members. We used to have 148, 150. So anybody who's still past due on their dues, please help Alex out by mailing in your information and your email address, name, phone number, stuff like that you want in the directory. That'll help out. Beyond that, all the bills are paid, everything's up to date, and we're just kind of like everybody else looking forward to getting into in person.
Yeah, real shame we couldn't do it tonight, but well, it was wiser, I think, anyway. So, all right, thank you much, Steve. Steve Antonik.
I really have nothing to report except that the sow bug down in Arkansas is still going to go ahead in third week of March. So if anybody's interested and you don't know the information, they have a website and/or call me and we'll fill you in with what's going on.
Thank you, Steve. Chris Friesen. Doc, you there? I don't see Chris.
I'm here.
What's up?
Well, we're trying to organize an impromptu fly fishing exposition, I guess, at Westover, of all calibers. I just reached out to Pat and hoped he would join us. It's probably not an official event, but we're going to do it on March the 16th, and people make their own reservations. We can carpool, drive down separately. Several people have talked about doing a morning event, and that's fine too. So we're still in the developmental stage, but I think it's a first opportunity to get more people involved. People maybe like myself who are not really skilled at fly fishing, and get a chance to meet some of the other members. It's more of a social event. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Scott Darrow is not here. He has nothing going on right now, but he's got stuff coming up, he says. Alex, I don't see Alex there. Alex, you here? I think not. Jim Guerra,
Yes,
what's up?
I'm still trying to find out if they're gonna do wetland for kids this year. I don't believe they are because of the present COVID situation, but I'll confirm that and get a message out to everybody.
Thank you. Rich Babel, outings.
Well, let's see, coming up will be the chili tie-in at Marlins Clubhouse. And that'll be on March 26th. Starting, I think, around 8 o'clock is when they start setting up, and then everybody be ready to go at around 9. And I think we had also, like to say, we had a great turnout down at the FYAO. That was a lot of fun. And let's see, of course, you had the all-day meeting coming up. And then of course, Steve said the sow bug is still on. And it looks like the next big thing will be the Memorial Weekend coming up in May.
Yeah, we're looking at probably having the barbecue again in June also, by the way. Not to jump ahead too far, but we're looking to do that again. So trying to get back in things if we can. Thank you much, sir.
You're welcome.
As far as I go, you've already heard about the all day on the 2nd of April. That's going to be Danny Barker on the White River. Innsbruck was good. We had about 12 people there, and that was good. We did a little bit of fishing afterwards, but it was really slow and really cold, and we didn't catch a whole lot. A couple fish were caught, but it was pretty slow. That was a good outing, though. We had a good time. Looking to get this thing back on track. I didn't make sure we got the right gauge of the wheels here going, but slowly going to start adding more events, I think, and slowly just get back in the swing of things. I think the COVID hopefully looks like it's dying down, but who knows for sure. Anything else? Paul, what's up?
Okay, well, as you guys mentioned, on April 2nd is the all-day meeting at Marlins Church. It's the same place we've always had these all-day meetings at the Community Christian Church off of south of Manchester, off of 141. And then the next things coming up really are April 28th and May 26th, the next real meetings and these are going to be held at Holy Cross Lutheran Church on Olive Street. And it looks like I've got an outfit called Cardiac Mountain Outfitters. It's kind of a guide service based in Rolla, and they have several guys in their company, if you will, that do this kind of guiding on for trout and different rivers in Missouri, including on the Merrimack. And the main guy who runs it is Damon Spurgeon. So for those two meetings, I think we're going to have basically, guys from his outfit that are going to be doing some presentations. So on April 28th and May 26th, I think they're going to be doing both of them. So that's all I got.
All right. Well, August, I got good news for you. We're done with all the business stuff. Now we're going to play. August is an educator by trade and has branched out in his professional career to build a new guide business targeting smallmouth along with trout and other species on the rivers just south of St. Louis, like the Merrimack and the Gascon. Basically, he's a guy who can do a day trip from St. Louis, as I understand. But August, take it. It's all yours.
Hello, everybody. Like Dan said, I'm from near St. Louis, about an hour south of there. And I've been running guide trips for the past, 2 years now. Been fishing for quite a bit longer than that, but I had been teaching and ended up taking a career change around 2 years ago that opened up quite a bit more time that would finally allow me to start a guide service. So I've been doing that these last 2 years, really ever since COVID. Once I got started right around the time the whole COVID thing got rolling. So that's kind of since then I've been building my guide service. My primary target species, I would say, for most of the year is smallmouth. In the springtime, as soon as it's warm enough for them to come out of their wintering holes, mostly focus on them until the fall around, October, November, they start getting back into wintering holes and slowing down quite a bit. And then, so really through October on until March or April is when I like to focus on trout. So it makes for a nice rotation of different species to chase for myself and then for my guide trips as well. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen with you guys so you can see my presentation. It might take just a moment. All right, can you guys see that now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thanks.
All righty. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so this will be mostly just kind of a basic overview, kind of entry level smallmouth presentation. Sometimes I'll get more in depth into specifics on flies and we'll really do deep dives into what types of patterns I like to throw or other parts of chasing smallmouth. We can make it pretty technical if we want, depending on time of year and whatnot. But this is kind of like my general guide to, if I was going to give someone a crash course in how to be effective with smallmouth, this would kind of be the information I would find most important to communicate to somebody. That's my dad there, you see on the cover with a nice little creek smallmouth. We got that one on a wade fishing trip, actually. So you don't even have to necessarily have access to a boat or a guide to find really quality fish here in Missouri. Pretty much everything I talk about here is going to be applicable anywhere, but mostly, specifically Missouri and around the Ozarks. So very applicable to stuff all you guys have, essentially right out your back door within a couple hours. And there's really even a couple streams that are probably under an hour from almost anybody in the St. Louis area. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the three major topics that we'll go over, and we'll break them down as we go along, but time and place to target smallmouth, and in that we'll look at locations, where to fish at a given time of day, and water types. Water types may be about the biggest thing with chasing bass, in my opinion. A lot of times various techniques will work, but if you're not fishing in the type of water that holds fish, you're not going to be real effective. So that's a big one. Also techniques. So we'll go over kind of the fun stuff like flies, what flies to stock in your box, etc. And then how to approach water. So angles of approach and things of that nature. And then kind of everybody's favorite, talking about, and probably the least important, would be gear. So we'll look at types of rods, what fly line to have, how to rig, your leaders, what supplies to carry, all that type of thing. So you're prepared for a day on the water. So we'll go ahead and get started with time and place.
Got it working.
Alrighty. So locations. Personally, I like to get into places as remote as possible to get away from the crowds. As a lot of you guys probably know, as fishermen, that's harder and harder to do these days. But you know, if you put some effort into it, you can normally put some distance between you and the vast majority of other people. A lot of the higher reaches or upper reaches of a lot of our streams are small enough to wade. They hold quality fish. And if you're willing to hike a little bit, you can, you know, get into places that are away from most people. You know, these aren't going to a lot of times they won't even be places that are easy to float, which that's a good thing if you want to avoid people. So here's a list, you know, all of these are excellent destinations. Most of them are, you know, relatively short drive from St. Louis. The Big River is probably the closest one, in my opinion, that's a quality fishery. That one, you know, you get down to around DeSoto, hop on 55 and you can be on the Big in a pretty short period of time. And there's a lot of good fish in there. That's one of our special management areas too, which is helpful. I think, you know, I think you can only, you know, I wish everything was catch and release, but it's 15-1 regulation. So that's good for the fish. So that's a short one. Merrimack is a really sizable fishery that I love. It may be my personal favorite, but you got to get a little ways away from St. Louis, in my opinion, before the quality of the river picks up some. So really everywhere above St. Clair on the Merrimack. So once you get to St. Clair on Highway 44, anywhere west of there in the Merrimack is, in my opinion, going to be really good quality bass fishing. Of course, we have the Burbus River, another close one. Personally, I haven't really explored the Burbus, but I know I hear good things. It's going to be a slower, kind of dirtier river, similar to the Big. So it might not be quite as scenic as the Merrimack, maybe not even as the Big, but honestly, I haven't spent really much time there. But I hear it's a good fishery. And it's remote, gets a little less traffic than the Big and the Merrimack, so that's always a good thing. Unpressured fish are, you know, just like fishing for trout in a small stream. If you're stealthy, a lot of times those unpressured fish can be tricked relatively easily. Gasconade River, this is a really big river. For most of this, you're pretty much going to need a boat, but really good one. You know, going to have to put a little more time behind the wheel of the car to get to a stretch of the Gasconade from here, but it's a good fishery as well. And then these last ones are a couple of smaller kind of wade fishing options. So parts of them are floatable, but they're great wade streams. Joachim, also right in DeSoto, not far from the Big River. Joachim Creek, St. Francis is in that southeastern part of the state. That's one to be careful on. This picture on this slide here is actually a shot of the St. Francis. A lot of shut-ins and whatnot on the St. Francis. It's not a super safe wade fishing creek just because of the depth in the plunge pools and the slick rocks. It would be an easy place to get hurt. So that's a good one. Also, if you can deal with, you know, maybe putting in some steel studs in your wading boots and and definitely carrying a wading staff would be necessary, almost absolutely necessary in my opinion. Mineral Fork's a great creek, tributary to the Big, much easier wading. It's a gravel bottomed kind of a stream. And then Big Creek is tributary to the St. Francis, which is flows through Sam Baker State Park. So there's good places to camp near Big Creek, and also good water for smallmouth. Really though, that's kind of a long list, to narrow down favorite streams. One of my favorite thing about smallmouth fishing in Missouri is we just have vast opportunities. If you're on the Ozark Plateau, pretty much any blue line that's big enough to be flowing 12 months out of the year, positively, if it's navigable and it's on the Ozark Plateau, it's going to contain a quality smallmouth fishery, in my opinion. So lots of miles of good fishing here. Alrighty. All right, so time. First of all, whenever you can go would be my opinion of the best time to go smallmouth fishing. I wouldn't try to be too picky about perfect conditions and that. Obviously, we all like those cloudy days ahead of a front and whatnot, but whenever you can go is most important. If I had to pick a day, second most important to whenever I could go would be stable conditions. So as soon as there's a major change in flows or atmospheric pressure, something like that, a lot of times that'll do weird stuff to the fish and make them a little bit tougher to target. But if you have several days in a row or a week straight of very consistent weather, normally the fish will get more patternable. So there's not a guarantee there's just going to be fish eating everywhere, ever. But if you've had stable conditions, a lot of times, if you're observant, you can figure out what the fish are doing, and then continue fishing in a way that's effective for how the fish are feeding. Fish are going to be eating even in the heat of the day. So a lot of times people want to get out and fish early in the morning or late in the evening. If they only have a few hours midday, they might not want to get out and deal with fishing. But from my experience, even in the heat of the summer, a lot of times middle of the day can be good. You might not have fish that are crazy aggressive that time of day, but there's still going to be feeding fish. It might just be more important to target shade lines or water that's moving faster. Sometimes the heat of the day is nice because the fish are going to be concentrated. They might not want to be out in the open, spread across a run in a river, at noon in August. There's a good chance that they are going to be possibly tighter to a bank or underneath logs in the middle of the river. They're going to be hiding from that sun. So sometimes that can actually concentrate fish, which is helpful, because then once you find them, then you kind of know what type of water they're going to be hiding in. In the wintertime and early spring, it's no hurry to get out first thing in the morning. A lot of times the water isn't warmed up as much as it could throughout the course of the day. So wintertime, don't feel like you have to get out super early or even stay out super late. So if you're fishing in the colder months for smallmouth, it's a good time to just do short, easy trips where you just fish for a couple hours midday, and then call it early. So doing short trips in the wintertime is never a bad thing. And then also don't let other anglers turn you away. There's many times on our streams where it can be very discouraging whenever you're out on a piece of water and there's dozens of other people around, or if anybody was out on the current. I guess this past weekend, there was lots of people out. We see that on the smallmouth streams just the same. And I wouldn't let that turn you away. Even if there's people fishing bait or lures and other techniques like that, a lot of times they aren't used to seeing flies, so they don't seem to be as educated to flies, or maybe it doesn't matter what you're throwing. But there's been numbers of times where I've fished behind someone and still been very successful. And even right underneath party and canoers on popular float stretches, we've had great fishing when there's all kinds of people making all kinds of racket or jet boats driving around. A lot of times that doesn't matter to the fish. It can be obnoxious when there's floaters and jet boats and people around when you're fishing and trying to enjoy nature. But I mean, honestly, on our rivers, if our fish didn't eat underneath floaters and jet boats, they'd probably starve to death. So I wouldn't let that be a discouraging thing whenever you see human activity out on the water. That's kind of just part of it in this part of the world. Alrighty. So types of water. Like I said before, this is maybe the most important part of smallmouth fishing is the type of water that the fish are going to be in. A lot of times the type of water itself is what's telling me what type of flies to tie on. Smallmouth bass, in my opinion, aren't particularly, they don't really study flies maybe quite the same way that some trout do. It's more about having a fly that's close to their face, kind of in their feeding zone. So a lot of times when I'm tying on a given fly, it has nothing to do with me thinking, oh, well, the fish might see this and think it's realistic. It has more to do with, okay, this is, the fish are in 10 foot of water. What am I going to tie on to effectively fish in 10 foot of water? Or maybe the fish are up shallow in 18 inches of water. So I can throw, a floating line with an unweighted fly or a topwater bug. So type of water is really, a big part of fly selection. So start out with riffles. So riffles or shoals, this is going to be your shallow, fast, broken water. Sometimes there's structure in here. A lot of times in Missouri, it's just shallow, gravelly. These areas, especially with some depth, are particularly good in the summer. In the summer months, a lot of our smallmouth streams get really warm. So the dissolved oxygen drops pretty far down. And while smallmouth are much more tolerant of low oxygen than trout are, they still do need, dissolved oxygen like anything. So they're going to be gravitating towards areas with that greater dissolved oxygen. And in the summer months, that's going to be your broken riffle water. So summertime is a great time to chase them in the riffles. Another thing about this shallower, faster water is that these are going to be more aggressive fish. So even if it's not summertime, if I'm drifting through a riffle, a lot of times we'll still be casting just because, okay, maybe there's not a fish here. But if there is, it's probably an aggressive, actively feeding fish. Or at the very least, the fly is going to be moving by quickly, as will any food source in a riffle. And the fish aren't going to have time to study it, to make any kind of a decision. That it's going to be a reaction strike when the fish are in that faster water. So a lot of times you might not want to, in the fall or spring, you might not want to spend a ton of your time fishing riffles, but if you're drifting through one, make a few casts isn't going to hurt anything. And if something's there, a lot of times they'll move pretty far to smash it. A lot of times when they're in riffles, it's helpful to have weighted flies, sometimes pretty heavily weighted flies, and possibly even a floating line to allow you to mend and kind of hold that fly in that faster riffle water. But you need some weight a lot of times to get down if they're really staged up in riffles. You either need weight or possibly a fairly quick sink tip and an unweighted fly. So moving downstream, normally riffles are going to pour into holes. So immediately following the riffle, there's going to be, normally a deep pool. At the head of these pools, there's going to be quite a bit of current as the riffle pours in. And then at the downstream end, you're going to see, nearly still water. So these holes, a lot of times, these are going to be what I'm focusing on in the springtime and early fall, sometimes in the late fall, depending on weather conditions. I find that in spring and early fall, I prefer these kind of holes towards the head of them where there's still some movement. Maybe not completely frog water, generally speaking, but a deep hole following a riffle. But also with structure is going to be a good thing. And that applies to almost any of these water types. These are going to be a water type that we look for. And then if there's boulders or logs in there, that's going to make them that much better. So these deep holes, like I said, spring and fall, particularly when there's boulders and logs. In these deeper holes and in the spring and fall, a lot of times I'm fishing flies that ride still hooked down, but possibly have some weight. So where if I'm fishing in riffles, I might be tying heavily weighted Klaus or minnow type stuff to fish. And that's going to be a midsummer tactic generally. Then in the spring and fall, when they're in these deeper holes, a lot of times I'll have a short, kind of moderately weighted sink tip, maybe a type 6, 12-foot sink tip in the spring and fall. And we'll be fishing things like Kelly Gallop's Sex Dungeon or Boogeyman, patterns like that. They're still going to have some side-to-side action, but enough weight where they do get down fairly deep. In that spring and fall, though, we're going to be rarely dredging these patterns along the bottom. A lot of times in the spring and fall, they're feeding heavily, and aggressively. So we don't have to slow down our retrieve to the point where the fly is dragging in the bottom of the river. But we do need to get down fairly deep because in spring and fall, a lot of times we have high enough water where that weight's going to be necessary to get the fly down to the fish. With an unweighted fly in the spring and fall, when they're in these deeper holes, a lot of times you might only be fishing a foot deep, and that's not always going to be deep enough to be effective in the spring and fall. And then moving on to the runs. So normally the runs are the longer kind of tail out section below a hole. These can be good in the fall as well. A lot of times fish will stage in the tail outs in the fall whenever they're feeding heavily to prepare for winter. And then if it's a very slow run below a hole with a lot of depth, particularly if it's on like a south facing bluff, these longer, deeper runs can hold fish 12 months out of the year. So they might be in a school in these longer, deeper stretches in the middle of the winter when the rivers are at their coldest point. So the winter is not a time that I personally do a ton of smallmouth fishing, just because I also love trout fishing. So your tactics in the winter time when the fish are in these deep runs are going to be very, very slow compared to spring, summer, and fall. So we might be using, fairly heavily weighted flies, essentially dredging the bottom in very deep water. Normally we're looking for the deepest water on a given stretch of river. So it's going to be, if you can, if it's not a terribly big river, a lot of times indicator fishing with jig style flies beneath an indicator can be effective. But a lot of times it's pretty boring way of fishing. If you're going to fish an indicator rig, a lot of times it's more fun to go to a trout stream where the water is faster and a little bit more interactive. So I don't spend a ton of time in the winter, but if you want a big fish, a lot of times your heaviest, largest fish are caught in the wintertime. You might catch much fewer fish. You get a couple fish in a day, and that's a pretty darn good day in the middle of the winter for fly fishing. But you have a somewhat higher likelihood of one of them being a giant fish. So, that's a bit of a draw for some people if you can brave the cold. And then structure. So I mentioned this a little bit already, but bass are extremely structure oriented. So, pick a type of water based on what time of year you're in my opinion. And then after that, then you need to be on the structure. That's extremely, extremely important. So this is kind of where you have to remain engaged all day long when you're fishing, is making sure that your flies are near structure. Probably the worst thing you can do is just cast your fly out and strip it back in, and cast your fly out and strip it back in. What's really important is pick apart the water. So, if it's in the spring and you're looking at a deep hole, you don't just want to walk through that or drift past it and just, bang the banks and pull the flies back in at a steady rate. You're going to want to look for boulders, ledges, logs, anything like that. And then you're going to want to focus your flies on them. They might be just off of a ledge, right on a depth change where it goes from, a lot of times you'll have 2 foot of water coming off the bank, and then there's a ledge and it drops down to 4 feet. Well, a lot of times that's very important. So, if you're fishing a ledge like that, you're going to want to mend your line as soon as you lay a cast down. Mend your line in such a way that the fly is going to run right along the edge where the fish are most likely to hang. If you're just casting it up in that 2 foot deep water and stripping it straight back to you without focusing on that ledge, then 90% of your cast isn't even in the water where the fish are going to tend to hang out. So it's really important to be engaged and paying attention while you're fishing. Anytime there's a log in the water, treat it almost identical to a rock ledge. You're going to want to throw a mend in your line and do your best to keep your flies right as close to the log as possible during as much of your retrieve as possible. And then the same goes for boulders. A lot of times, you'll get a few fish that hang in kind of the cushion, you might say, of water ahead of a boulder, but even better yet, just behind the boulder is going to be a good place to be. So if you're drifting down the river and you have to make a quick decision, fish ahead of a boulder or behind a boulder, I would generally pick behind. Smallmouth are pretty lazy, so they're going to want that eddy water to rest in near the fast water coming around a boulder so they can dart out and grab food as it goes by. So, a lot of times if there's a boulder in the center of a run, making a long cast on the other side of it, that way the fly achieves the proper depth by the time it's, in the wash behind the boulder. That's important. Pretty much covers that. One thing about structure that can be difficult in certain types of weather conditions, a lot of times if we get a high water event and the water gets cloudy, that doesn't necessarily hurt the fishing. Sometimes high water can be really good. The issue that I find most difficult, in my opinion, is that then you can't see the structure. So sometimes the fish are very aggressive and they'll dart out of structure and it doesn't matter if you're fishing close to it. Other times, if the fish are, not really cooperating, you really have to keep a fly near structure for a long time in order to convince them to eat. So if the water gets cloudy from a storm, a lot of times you can't see where the structure is to fish. And the other problem is if you think you know where the structure is and you're trying to fish as close to it as possible, despite not being able to see it, you end up getting snagged more. So you go through a lot more flies when the water's dirty. So, high water events and, if there's heavy jet boat traffic, a lot of times that murks up the water and that can be a little bit difficult. I would just try to remember that, the fish are still there, possibly still feeding. It's just, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to keep your flies near the structure and possibly sacrifice some flies. So a lot of times having, flies similar to a Clouser minnow that ride hook point up or flies that are very quick to tie is important when the water gets dirty. If they're hook point up, you're going to snag a little bit less. And if they're quick to tie, then it doesn't hurt quite so bad when you have to break them off and leave them in the log or whatever. Alrighty. So these are some illustrations I actually pulled from a catfishing article from In Fisherman, but they're really good illustrations of a riffle, a hole, and a run. So I thought I'd include them. I'm sure, you guys for the most part probably get what I'm saying, but it's helpful to have an illustration. So up here in the riffle section on the right hand side of that top illustration, you'll see the faster broken water. And then, it's going to plunge off into a deeper hole. Going to have some swirling and faster currents up at the head of the hole. And then towards the run area, that hole will slow down. The current a lot of times speeds out. Then you have like a longer, shallower run, ending with a tail out ahead of the next riffle. And then, of course, we just have, this other illustration here down on our left, lower left here. Just an aerial view, same kind of thing. You see rocks through the riffles. Normally we'll see a lot of gravel and maybe not a ton of structure in our riffles. But then in the holes and runs, that's where a lot of times you're going to see log piles that are good places to fish. Alrighty. So moving on to techniques. So flies are going to be a big part of what techniques we're using. So the first thing that we'll talk about, probably just because of their popularity for bass fishing, is jig flies. These are honestly probably my least favorite style of fly to throw for smallmouth for a couple reasons, but they're absolutely necessary to carry if you're just wanting to be effective. And they're, a lot of them are really good flies with a lot of history to them as well. My main problem with the jig flies is a lot of times I'm using them in those, wintering holes or I'm using them on slower days when the fish aren't cooperating. So a lot of times it's not necessary to have the weight of a jig fly. So you're kind of forced into using them when the fishing is slow. Normally they're, sorry, I got some dogs in the background. But the jig flies are going to be also a touch harder to cast, as you guys know, with a fly rod, you get much weight, and then it's tougher to cast them. Break rods now and then. I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably clousered a rod or two, had a poor cast and a fly comes low and fast over your shoulder and slaps the side of a fly rod, and eventually that fly rod might fail on you. So there's some disadvantages, but they're good to have. So patterns I like. I pictured the Kelly Gallops bottoms up. They're on the right. Essentially, a Russ Madden circus peanut is really what it is, which is really just a fancy woolly bugger. Gallops bottoms up, though, has two foam popper bodies on the back hook. So it's an articulated pattern. Two large hooks weighted on the front hook, and then the back hook has the foam popper bodies in it. And I like that at times because those foam popper bodies will allow the fly to jig still, but that foam in the back will make it stand almost perfectly vertical whenever you stall it. So it kind of sticks up off the bottom like a Ned rig, if you're familiar with spinning or casting gear at all. So it's visible to the fish well, and it's just such a dramatic jigging action that I think it catches their eye. And then the addition of that foam, it kind of slows the drop a little bit. So it doesn't just plummet, like a depth charge all the way down to the bottom. A lot of times it's a nice slow drop. And I really value a long stall between strips. So we're pretty much always casting flies out. And then to retrieve them, we have the rod tip low and we're, stripping the line in. With a fly that drops a little bit slower or sinks a little bit slower, I can give very long stalls between strips, which allows to work those flies slowly near logs or boulders to convince the fish to eat. So it can be important to slow that fly down a little bit. A lot of times, especially slow days, sometimes we'll count maybe several seconds between strips. And a lot of times it's on that long pause when the fish eat. So, and even on the best fishing days, I think normally, even if you're stripping relatively quickly and having success, a lot of times it's still on the pause that the fish eat. So that's an advantage to that gallops bottoms up. And then a very simple pattern, relatively simple, the bars meat whistle. Just a bunny strip with some marabou rubber legs and a cone. Pretty simple fly, but really probably about my favorite as far as jig flies go, just because it has a really nice action, relatively quick to tie. And if you don't tie, the nice thing about the bars meat whistle is the ones that I generally see stacked on, in bins at fly shops. A lot of times they're tied on a gamakatsu hook. So very high quality hook, which is pretty important with bass. They have relatively bony mouths. So sometimes a hook set is tough to get on bass compared to trout. At least trout with small flies anyways. So having a good quality sharp hook is important. So that bars meat whistle will generally come on a gamakatsu hook. So that's good. Most of your jig flies, generally speaking, have an up and down kind of movement, just like a jig. So there's a few of them that have a slight side to side action as well. The Gallops Boogeyman is one that I really like, because while it does move up and down quite a bit, if you're watching it fish back to the boat, it's moving, quite side to side as well. And a lot of times it's seeing that side profile of a bait that convinces a bass to eat. So, that Boogeyman is a nice one, because it will still jig and get down deep when I need it to get deep, but it has that added trigger of that slight side profile. So a lot of times any jig flies you can see the side of them a little bit too between strips. That's really a nice action to have. And the bars meat whistle does a little bit of that too, depending on what size cone you tie on there. If you don't tie a super, super heavy cone head on your meat whistles, a lot of times they'll still turn a little bit to the side between strips, which is good. And then for when we're going to fish them. So I'll carry these patterns, essentially all year long on bass fishing trips. But the times that I find myself reaching for these most often is going to be in the wintertime, if we're dredging very deep holes. So if we're needing to be near the bottom for a long period of time, obviously a jig fly is going to be a really easy way to get down deep. So dredging deep in winter, or even drifting them under an indicator. A lot of times a jig fly is the way to go. And then in the springtime, we get, pretty consistently high water. There's some streams I like to fish that, midsummer might run 30 to 50 CFS, and in the higher springtime flows, they might run 300 CFS. And, if they ran like that for a while, they might run clean and fish really well, but you have to kind of alter techniques to be effective. So, you might, even if fish are being aggressive and eating in relatively shallow water, you still might need a fly with some lead in it in order to get down deep enough, or stay in the strike zone before the fast water just blows the fly downstream. So your higher spring flows and your wintertime, they're going to be helpful to have. If you're fishing smaller jig flies, possibly somebody that's just getting into smallmouth fishing, maybe all you have is a 4-weight or a 5-weight fly rod, and you're not wanting to invest a ton yet in smallmouth, getting you some Clouser minnows, that's a great little jig fly with a tremendous history, with smallmouth especially. A small, 2-3 inch long Clouser minnow will throw great on a 5-weight, and be effective, all year long, really. You can tie them with bead chain eyes so they don't sink quite as quickly. That'll help you keep from snagging, but still get you deep enough, even with a floating line, where if you take your 5-weight out wade fishing, that can be a great pattern to start with. Beadhead woolly bugger, another great simple option that you can throw on a small 3 to 5 weight rod that'll still catch smallmouth just fine. Alrighty, so swim flies. These are personally might be my favorite flies to fish for smallmouth. It'd be between swim flies and topwater. Everybody loves to see a trout feeding up. So, the smallmouth is kind of the same thing, really. It's a lot of fun, but the swim flies, these are really just your big unweighted bait fish, like brown trout streamers, really. You can tie them smaller and throw them on a smaller rod, but the fish and swim flies for smallmouth holds, kind of has a lot of the same things about it that people like about fishing streamers for brown trout. There's countless options on the market and different styles of patterns, but I listed a couple of my favorites here. The Tommy Lynch's Drunken Disorderly. That's that big articulated fly in the lower right. It's essentially a Rapala jerkbait imitation is really what it is. You can see that kind of downward pointing wedge shaped head on it. That's essentially to function as a diving lip, much like on a Rapala or Smith Rogue jerkbait. Very effective fly. Then there's the Jim Stouffer's Shuttlecock, which is essentially a version of a Bob Popovic style deceiver. That'd be up in the top right. And that's just a bucktail and hackle in Arctic fox as well. But it's essentially a deceiver. So any of your deceiver style flies are going to be, excellent smallmouth flies. Yeah, fished on a sink tip. They're really my favorite. And most of the year, they're probably the most effective way to target smallmouth as well. I listed the Murdoch minnow here as well. That's that single hook fly lower left. That's maybe my favorite if I had to pick a guide fly, just because it's an extremely effective pattern. Pretty easy to tie, up to 5 inches long. So you can tie it large or you can tie it smaller relatively easily. And it doesn't hold any water when you pick it up. So extremely easy fly to cast. It swims really nice. They're a real quick tie as well. They don't take very long. So it's one that when it gets thrown up in a tree, on a lot of our little smallmouth streams, you have trees almost touching up above you. So a lot of flies end up in the trees when you're chasing smallies. So fishing a fly like the Murdoch minnow, kind of eases the pain a little bit whenever your hard work ends up 20 foot above you or something. So Murdoch, the action. So swim flies. So these are going to be swimming. So where the jig is sinking quickly and, going, kind of up and down like this in the water column, covering various parts of it. The swim fly will normally be running in one part of the water column for the most part, but it's going to be turning side to side and showing a side profile of the bait fish. So in my opinion, that side to side action 9 times out of 10 is what triggers the fish to eat. So with these swim flies, a lot of times you'll give them a strip, the fly will dart forward, and then as it slows down, it'll turn and coast to the side like this. And a lot of times when they turn sideways like that and slow down, maybe to a complete stop, that's going to be when you see a smallmouth eat it. So that side to side, very important with those things. And then you vary what part of the water column they're in with the sink tip that you use. During certain parts of the year, an intermediate line might be wonderful for how deep the fish are. Other times of the year, you might need something that sinks a little bit quicker. You can also give shorter or longer pauses between strips to allow whatever sink tip you have to draw your fly deeper into the water column if necessary. So there's a variety of ways you can cover various parts of the water column. So these, like I said, they're side to side moving patterns. Some of them dive a little bit. That drunken disorderly that I talked about will definitely dive down pretty quickly. A lot of times with that one, you kind of have to be careful because it'll get down quicker than you'd expect it to. It's got a deer hair head, so it's very buoyant at first, but as you start to strip it in and that wedge head digs in, it'll wiggle down pretty deep, kind of like a crankbait. So these move like some people call them a stick bait, or if you're familiar with the top water plug called a spook, it's a cigar shaped plug that walks side to side on the top of the water that a lot of people fish with casting gear. These are a subsurface pattern generally, but that spook action varies side to side is what we're going for with these. Or there's one called a zoom fluke. It's a soft plastic. A lot of guys fish with spinning gear, a very effective lure. These flies in a lot of ways just kind of mimic that fluke action. So with these, like anything, varying your retrieve is going to be a big deal in figuring out what the fish are doing. So when you get to the river, you might be starting out with quick, short strips, maybe 3-4 inch long strips without very long pauses between them. And then if you're not having much luck, you might give it like a little bit, start with maybe a 1 second pause. And then if you're not having success, maybe give it a 2 second pause between strips. Or rather than doing a short, quick strip, maybe try a longer, slower strip. Just like variance in your retrieve is really important with your swim flies. You'll notice, if you guys are looking at the presentation here, the ones I have pictured are brightly colored, and I'm partial to that, particularly white-based flies. White seems to be very effective. I think it's probably just similar to many of our bait fish here in Missouri. So I think a white fly is natural. The other thing about white or other brightly colored flies is that not only maybe it's natural, but the other thing that I think is maybe even a bigger advantage is you can see those brightly colored white flies. So if you can see them, that allows you to do several things that maybe the jig flies don't. A jig fly is going to run deep. Many times they're natural colored flies. You can't really see them. So these brightly colored swim flies, they're not going to run quite as deep. And with that color, you're going to be able to track them from the moment they land out in front of you all the way, pretty much back to the boat or back to you while you're wade fishing. So that's going to allow you to let that fly get really close to structure. So, if you have fish that are, not cooperating super well, the longer that fly is pausing near structure, might convince them to eat. A lot of times those long pauses near structure is what it might take to turn a slow day of fishing into a really good day. So these brightly colored flies allow that. If they have quite a bit of flash in them, you can see them super well, even down into 6-8 foot of water. So you'll see them, you'll be able to let them get much closer to cover. That's also going to help you keep from losing flies. So if you can see a white colored fly or a chartreuse colored fly, you'll be able to tell when you're getting really close to a log or a boulder, and then you can raise your rod tip or strip really quickly to try to get that fly from hanging up in a log. And then, not quite as much of an advantage, but if you can see those flies, it makes the eats from the smallmouth extremely visual. So if you can track exactly where your fly is and you can see it, a lot of times you'll see a fish following. Since it's easy to track your fly, you'll be observing the area around your fly. A lot of times you can see a fish move off a structure. That's exciting. It's really exciting. And a lot of times they'll move in fast and really smash a fly hard, much like a brown trout. So having a brightly colored fly, particularly swim fly, can really help that. I do tie, normally keep a few in my box that are swim flies that are still a more natural or a more subdued color. Sometimes a few in black or a few in olive or tan, something like that. It's good to have. Sometimes color seems to matter, but not all the time. I think it's good to be flexible and have a variety of colors in all your different styles of flies. But generally speaking, I think with your swim flies, if you have white-based flies, for most of your arsenal, I think that's probably a pretty good idea. Whereas with your jig flies, maybe more natural or crayfish type colors is a good idea. All righty, I think that's about it for the swim flies. And then topwater. So a lot of times topwater is what brings people into the sport of chasing smallmouth, is just those topwater explosions. I don't think anybody can deny that we all love that. If fly fishermen, seeing a fish feed up is kind of what got a lot of us into this. You'll see pictured, I got two patterns here that are kind of my favorites. That would be the deer hair frog over here on the left, and then the blue popper as well. Personally, I feel that the specific pattern that you're running with topwater, it's probably, of all the different styles, it's probably the least important to have a specific pattern or profile. I think normally the fish are seeing just a little bit of buggy-like movement up there, maybe hearing some racket, and they're just coming up to eat whatever it is. Generally, I feel that way generally, although I have to say I'm quite, I'm a pretty big fan of the hair frog and the blue poppers. They're good. Boogle bugs, any of your foam poppers or hair bass bugs. There's many different types. Some people even make balsa wood poppers, which they're great as well. So one I pictured here is essentially a take on Larry Dahlberg's Dahlberg Diver. I think Umpqua sells it as a hair frog. And then, various poppers and sliders, or sneaky Pete's, they call them. Any of those are going to be effective patterns. One that I personally don't use much, but I know in parts of the world they're super popular. They call them a Mr. Wiggly. It's just like a foam strip with some rubber legs, kind of like a chubby Chernobyl. Essentially, a big chubby Chernobyl would probably work quite well. But those Wigglies or probably a chubby thrown on a 5-weight would be another way you could take your trout gear. If you're new to smallmouth fishing, you can take your trout gear onto a smallmouth creek and probably have pretty good success. A lot of the popping bugs, you can fish them pretty small and they still make a lot of racket on the top of the water when you pop them. So you could throw pretty small poppers and be effective. A lot of your bigger sizes are quite wind resistant. On most if I go out fishing, a lot of times I'll carry a 7-weight with a sink tip for fishing streamers, and then I'll actually, if I have the choice, my top water I'll throw like on an 8-weight, just because those topwater bugs are so much more wind resistant. So it's helpful to have a heavier line weight if possible. But again, I think whatever gear you have is going to be probably some way you can make it work. The action that most of your topwater bugs have mostly don't quite have really an action per se, the way that your jig or swim flies do, I don't think. What's most important that poppers do really well and your hair diving bugs do really well is you just give them a short short little strip, and it makes a popping sound. Personally, I like to minimize the amount of pops when I'm fishing topwater. Even if we're making relatively short casts, I like the pop that we make when we strip them. I like it to just barely be a big enough pop to be audible. So, you know, a lot of times people want to throw them out and chug them back to the boat really loud and make a ton of racket, kind of like a buzz bait or something. But in my opinion, they should almost be fished more like a dry fly than like a topwater lure. So most of the time we'll cast them out, and as soon as they land, we'll just let them sit. We might pull on our line just enough to straighten out your leader in case a fish eats, so you can get a hook set. But just keep the line just tight enough in case you need to set the hook, but just leave the fly sit and dead drift like a dry fly. And after the rings from around the fly landing have completely disappeared, then you can give it a little pop. You just barely audible. And then let the fly go back to dead drifting again. And again, once the rings have disappeared again, then you can give it another little pop. Most of the time, 9 times out of 10, the fish are going to eat between those pops. And sometimes after a really, really long stall, a lot of times, if you're not paying close attention, you might be talking to somebody or maybe reaching down to have a drink or something like that. All of a sudden, the bug gets eaten. And I think what it is the fish just really like that long dead drift. So that long stall is really important with those things. And then you kind of have to alter your hook set with a topwater bug as well. It's kind of a weird hybrid hook set where most of our bass fishing, we're doing a saltwater style strip set with a low rod angle and a hard strip. With your topwater, it's kind of a hybrid. You're going to raise the rod a little bit, but not completely a traditional trout set, but a little bit of raised rod angle as well as a strip with your topwater. All righty. Here's just some fish porn. These are actually all fish from wade fishing trips here. So, no giants, but they're fish plenty big enough to be fun for Missouri. So those are all fish that, with less than a couple miles of wading, I would say. A lot of these streams are very close to the St. Louis area. So those are all very attainable fish right there. Alrighty, so approach. So this is kind of how we approach the water, or how we cast once we're on the water. So a lot of times upstream, so approaching fish from downstream, casting up. This can be useful in some situations, but not most, I would say. It's easier to line fish, kind of like an issue you might have saltwater fishing, dry fly fishing. This is good if you're sight fishing in low, clear summer water. Maybe you're on a very small stream, you can wade fish. So a lot of times it's nice to be able to walk a small stream and sight cast a fish. But most of the time, we're going to be using a down and across type of approach. Wade fishing, you got to be careful. You can spook fish.
Yeah, hang on a second.
Sorry, what?
Hello.
Okay. So you can possibly spook more fish with a down and across approach, but it's a better angle when fishing from a boat. And in most situations, if you're fishing streamers, it's going to be a good angle, even if you're wade fishing. When you're fishing down and across, it can be less effective with topwater. You just kind of have to compensate with your casting. So if I'm working downstream, I'm fishing a topwater bug, normally I'll approach I'll work into a hole, but I might cast slightly more upstream of the boat and let it drift past, rather than just casting downstream. I don't like, and this goes for streamers too, but I really don't like it if a fly is coming upstream at all towards the boat. I might cast across and down slightly, but we still want that streamer or top water moving mostly across the current for the most part. If you're wade fishing, stealth can be a really big deal, particularly with the down and across approach. This might require a little bit longer casts. Just normally fish when they're stationed, they're looking upstream, so you have to keep that in mind, particularly wade fishing. If it's a big enough water to float, it doesn't seem that the fish are as spooky to me. But wade fishing, small creeks, definitely going to need to make possibly longer casts, or watch your shadows when you're walking up the holes with those down and across approaches. And this kind of goes for anything, any species, is going to be work from your feet out. So a lot of times, not quite to the same degree that you see it with trout, but a lot of times you'd be surprised at how close the smallmouth might be to your boat when you're fishing, or how far off the bank. They might be very close to the center of the river if there's structure there. So you might not need to cast completely across the stream in order to target the fish. They're not always on that opposite bank. If there's structure for them and moving water to bring them food, they might be, right out in the middle of the water, in the middle of the stream. So almost always, especially wade fishing, I'll start close. Maybe I'll walk up to a hole, make a few shorter casts, and then I might make a cast 3/4 of the way across the pool, and then maybe land a couple on the bank too, if it's in an area where I'm able to cast that far. But in the boat, when we're fishing out of the boat, a lot of times it's pretty close range fishing, really. So yeah, start close is always good. Alrighty, gear. So we'll go ahead and talk about the gear that you're going to need. And, kind of priority one with this stuff, don't overemphasize your gear. You can normally make things work. Rods, I like to recommend 6 to 8 weights for smallmouth. But smaller, a lot of your smaller swim flies and even little tiny clousers or woolly buggers throw great on 4 to 5 weight rods. So don't think that, if you've historically just been a trout fisherman and all you have is, 3 to 5 weight rods, don't feel like in order to catch a smallmouth, you have to immediately go out and buy an 8 weight. It's just not necessary, Just dial back the size of your patterns a little bit for a while and see if you even like smallmouth fishing. I think you probably will, but a 5 weight's just fine for your smaller flies. But some of the bigger jig flies and big topwater stuff, they might require power a little bit more often, but that's something, you can deal with, on down the road if you decide you really want to get into the bass fishing. Reels, much like with most freshwater fishing, these are in no way critical. Just like everything else in freshwater, almost everything else in freshwater, they're pretty much just a line storage system. Some of your nicer reels or larger arbor reels might help because might help your fly line last a little bit longer. That large arbor might not put as bad a coils in your fly line. And also if you're trying to roll line up real quick to move locations, sometimes those larger arbor reels are nice. And then they look cool too, if you like an attractive fly reels. That's important to some people, but absolutely in no way a requirement. I do say that having 1 or 2 spare spools or reels is really good. particularly if you're wade fishing where you can't carry, 4 different rods rigged up in different ways. Sometimes it's nice to have, 1 or 2 different sink tips as well as a floating line. Normally, in a given time of year, you normally know roughly the type of sink tip you're going to need, though, and then just a floating line if you decide to fish top water. The floating lines, absolutely necessary to fish top water. And a lot of times they're good for jig flies, your Clouser minnows and whatnot too. I'm partial to the heavier headed floating lines, kind of shooting style lines. Your bass taper stuff. SA makes one called a shark wave, or they were for a while. That was a great textured line, kind of hard on your fingers if you have a good day of fishing, but perform great. But really just any of the heavier headed stuff. Some of your saltwater lines probably work pretty good. If you have a bonefish or a redfish line, that would probably transfer over to bass fishing pretty well. And then your sink tips. Personally, I gravitate towards the shorter sink tips that are lighter in weight as well. The really big, fast tips like you see guys throwing down on the White River, I don't think allow enough of a long pause to be effective or as effective as they could be on our rivers. So normally a 12-foot sink tip is what I use. I'm really right now partial to the Scientific Anglers 135 as a 12-foot tip. That's like 5 inches per second, then 3 inches per second. And the line is all intermediate. I find it's very sensitive to takes and performs really good. That intermediate running line can be a little bit of a problem wade fishing because it'll sink into your feet worse than a traditional sink tip. But I really like that SA 135. It's a good line. And then if you fish a lot of slow water, it's good to have an intermediate. In the case of those intermediates, this past year, I've been really liking the Cortland. I think it's a Cortland clear tip intermediate. It's a 24-foot, it's like 1.5, 2 IPS, something like that, fairly light. And it's a clear tip, but it's a very heavy in grain weight. So it casts really nice, but it sinks extremely slowly. So really good for some of our larger streams where you're making long casts, or our slower streams like the Big River. And then down at the bottom, I put those Versatip leaders, little sinking leader things you can loop onto a floating line. Kind of handy if you're really new to fishing streamers or bass fishing, because you can just throw them on your floating line. But in my opinion, they just have too many drawbacks to be much of an option beyond just your early experimentation to see if you like throwing streamers. I don't like a big loop-to-loop connection that you're constantly stripping into the guides, and it's hard to roll cast back up. And then if you get a fish hooked and you're trying to land it by yourself and the fish darts away, it wants to hang in the guides. And they're not easy to, continue tying new leaders onto the end of on those Versatips for adding tippet and whatnot. You kind of end up into the sinking portion of them pretty quickly. So they're an inexpensive option if all you have is a floating line, but I would say that they're probably going to be more frustrating than what they're worth, in my opinion. Rigging. So leaders, you can buy tapered bass or streamer style leaders for this. I would recommend just tying your own. It's much cheaper that way. It's what I like to do. And bass really don't seem to be leader shy to me. So I don't see any disadvantage with having a few knots. I've kind of a leader system that I like, that I've learned from other guides and other bass anglers, and I've kind of adapted it and played with it. Normally what I'll start with is a heavy mono butt section of 30 pound. Then that ties into a 20 pound section. And I normally on the end of that put like 18 inches of fluorocarbon or 12 pound monofilament. And I gave you a range 3 to 5, 2 to 3, and then either fluoro or the Maxima mono. My butt section on my streamer leaders is normally 3 foot of 30, down to 2 foot of 20, and then your fluorocarbon. If I'm fishing top water, I'll normally have 5 foot of 30-pound monofilament to 3 foot of 20-pound monofilament, to 18 inches of 12-pound mono. And I like using that mono for my tippet on my top water stuff. It keeps the especially smaller top water bugs from being drug under a little bit by that fluorocarbon. And then the other thing is that it's just cheaper. And if you fish for them much, using fluorocarbon does add up. So it's nice to, kind of have a spool of mono to save some money on whenever you can. And you can use mono for your tippet on your streamers as well. It's just that I've noticed that it does, when it hits the gravel on the bottom, you do see the abrasions in it, and you have to retie a little bit more often if you're fishing mono as opposed to fluoro on your streamer leaders. I've gotten where I almost exclusively just carry 0x or like 15, 16 pound fluorocarbon. It doesn't hurt to have a couple other sizes to try, especially if you're using a little bit smaller bugs. But from my experience, if they'll eat, if you can get them to eat, they'll eat them with 0x. So I really just like to use the strongest I can get away with. I can play the fish much more quickly, get them released ASAP. I essentially treat smallmouth the same way that I treat trout when I'm catching and releasing them. I try to keep them in the water, and try to play them as quick as possible, not wear them out. So I find that 0x for conservation reasons, as much as being effective, is the way to go. Also, if you have that heavier tippet, you lose less flies too. If it ends up hung in a tree branch, a lot of times you can pull a little bit harder before it breaks the tippet. That heavier fluorocarbon is really good, and pretty much invisible in the water too. Really, I just use, for the most part, 3 knots when I'm fishing for bass anyways. I like a loop knot to attach my streamer or my top water bug. The lefties, I think it's a lefties loop knot. There's a variety of other saltwater loop knots that'll work. A perfection loop, and then a nail knot for emergencies. So these are probably all knots that you guys have had some background with. Perfection loop really for me has 2 major purposes. I like it to loop my leader onto my fly line, onto my welded loop. And then where I connect my 30-pound to my 20-pound to my tippet, when I'm building my leaders, I actually really like just using loop-to-loop connections. So I'll just have on each section of my leader, I'll have a perfection loop on either side, and I just loop them together. As far as I can tell, the fish don't notice. They don't seem to refuse flies as a result. And that perfection loop has an extremely high breaking strength compared to other knots. It's right there with a blood knot, if not better. And it's quicker and easier to tie. So because the fish don't seem to be bothered by it, I'm partial to just using the loop to loop connection. And then here's your lefty cray loop, or I think some people call it a Rapala loop. It's actually, I think, the loop that's on the back of the packages for Rapala jerk baits and stuff. And it's essentially a clinch knot, really, just with an additional step of this overhand knot that it ends in an open loop, which allows your streamer, more movement. So I really feel that loop knot's pretty. You can use a clinch knot to tie your streamers on, and that works, but I really do feel that loop knot makes a pretty big difference in the way that the flies swim. And where trout sometimes maybe fine tippets and being natural might be the most important thing. I feel with bass, the most important thing is action and being in their face. So that loop is going to give that fly better action. And then, of course, the nail knot we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about why we need that one, but I find that it's just a good thing to have
Not going to bed yet.
as an emergency.
Anything out of my laundry basket.
So, traditionally you tie your leaders on with a nail knot.
Lick my lead.
But
Lick the
if you
bottom
break
of
a
the
weld
shower.
loop on your fly line, you can use the nail knot to put a loop back on to keep fishing, or even if you cut a fly line, you can splice it back together with a series of nail knots to finish out your day in the case of an emergency. One thing, many people probably have dealt with this, but carrying a small straw like a coffee stir or a nail knot tool is really helpful if you end up needing this one. And then gear, this is kind of like any fishing trip, having water, food, your rain gear, a trash bag in case you have food trash, or if you find trash on the river, you need to have a trash bag to put it in. A camera if you want to take pictures of your fish or the scenery. First aid kit, not really an option. You don't want to end a trip early because of some silly injury, and then of course we always want to be safe on the water. A landing net. I'm huge on landing nets. I think you land way more fish with a net than you do without, and it's way better for the fish. You don't have to play fish to exhaustion if you carry a net. You can normally rush them and get them in the net quick. Without having to be hard on them. So that's nice. And it allows a nice soft place where you can keep them in the water to get them unhooked and released safely. Hemostats for removing flies and pinching barbs. Most of the time when I'm smallmouth fishing, I pinch barbs down for the safety of the fish. And then also a lot of times getting a 1/0 hook stuck in you is really nice if you have no barbs on there. So since we fish big hooks, it can be nice to have barbless for our own safety, as well as the fish. Of course, your flies, line cutters, you want to have a nice convenient pack to carry all your gear. And then shoes for fishing. This is, just as much of a problem as with trout. I like sandals, but, sometimes you end up bloody in toes if you're wading and stuff, or fly lines always getting tangled on sandals. Probably your most effective thing would just be putting on your regular wading boots and some wading socks if you're going to be doing the wade fishing thing. Alrighty, and that's pretty much kind of the conclusion here. I wouldn't get too overwhelmed with gear or where to go for smallmouth. If you have a car, that'll get you to plenty of good places. Better yet, a 4x4 and a boat might get you to some really unpressured fish. They tend to be chasing streamers or feeding up, so they kind of are always doing the things that us fly fishermen want fish to do. So in my opinion, the smallmouth is really like a purpose-built fly fishing quarry, really. They got really highly visual, aggressive eats. Summertime, spot and stalk, kind of, New Zealand style type fishing, and some of our small streams can be a whole lot of fun. And a lot of these remote little streams have some giant fish in them. Kind of just make sure you're working flies near cover with lots of good action and staying focused. That's kind of the big thing. And that's pretty much all I have, really.
Thank you, August. Do we have any questions out there?
Yeah. I have a question. If you were to say, for starting out on smallmouth, close to St. Louis, a good wade fishing spot to go first time, what would be your recommendation?
Let's see. Upper Big. That's going to be quite a ways from St. Louis, maybe an hour. But it's easy wading if you get really high on Big, like near Caledonia or so. It's going to be a nice gravel bottom stream. Big River's good for that. Joachim in DeSoto is a very small, nice wade fishing creek. One thing I'd say about Joachim is that there's a lot of like really slick shelf rock that's easy to fall on, stuff like that. But if you're careful or you have a staff or some good wading boots, Joachim's probably the closest. And then Mineral Fork, there's that Kingston access on the Mineral Fork. Gets a ton of traffic down there. Maybe not, and it's big enough down there that it's not super easy to cover much territory. But there's, it's nice gravelly bottom stream, easy wading in a few holes. So that's a good one. You get very high on the Merrimack, and there's some pretty good wade fishing up there also.
Thank you.
Chris, I got a couple questions for you. How do you find your access points? And how many of these small streams and creeks flow through private property, and what are the Missouri laws for fishing there?
So let's see. So to find access point, my main resources are going to be that Missouri Paddler's Guide. That's probably what I lean on the hardest. It's a publication, I believe, from Conservation Department, and it's gonna give you access points that you can get to, and those are all going to be on navigable streams. Most of them are going to be on places that are maybe a little bit more for floating than wading, but they're definitely going to get you places you can go to try. Many of them have canoe liveries you can put in on as well. As far as the smaller streams go, it's pretty important to do your research and watch for posted signs and whatnot. If it's navigable, so if it can be floated 12 months out of the year, you can technically be there. If you access at a public access point. I don't know the exact rule or the exact wording of the law, but I would certainly be mindful of no trespassing signs. Definitely accessing at a public point. Pretty much any place that you legally can access is probably going to be marked. Most of the time, if it's a conservation access, there will be Missouri Smallmouth Alliance signs there that explain the growth charts for smallmouth and how slow they grow, and why catch and release is so important. But yeah, most of the time, if you can, get on Conservation Department's site or that Missouri Paddler's Guide, that would be my recommendation.
Thanks.
Yep.
Got a couple of comments here from Priscilla. She says, great presentation, thanks. And Chris Friesen says, enjoyed it, Augie, thanks.
Well, thank you guys.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Dan, this is Steve Lekich.
I know you.
Yeah, I hope so. Augie, some of the streams, like we were talking about the Mineral Fork with the Kingston access, I know it's a smallmouth, I guess, a specialty zone, as is the Mineral Fork. But I think DeSoto is really like the only place you can get into the Mineral Fork unless you're going through private property, or down by Herculaneum, which is really not, I guess, smallmouth fishing. And Kingston is probably the only one on the Mineral Fork. So it makes it kind of tough to fish those, even though they're management areas.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the Joachim, they're in DeSoto and then down at Herculaneum. Yeah, and then Mineral Fork, there's maybe, I guess, really only there's really just the one. There's Kingston on Mineral Fork and Walter Park and DeSoto on Joachim, and that's your only access point. So that those places get a lot of pressure right at that location, but most of the rest of those creeks don't get much pressure. But yeah, unless you know somebody, there's not really a lot we can do about that. There's just no access. If you could find a way to get into those places, if you know someone that owns property, or if you could go knocking on doors and ask for permission in a way that's polite, I would imagine you're going to hear no a lot, but If you could find a way, to get someone's permission to get out on those streams, they would probably fish really, really good because they probably don't see a lot of fish. If you really, and that goes for any stream, if you can get onto a stretch of water without much people, you end up finding kind of stupid fish, which is my favorite.
And Augie, I would say maybe since this is the first time you've made a presentation for the group, maybe tell us a little bit about your guiding service and rates and when you work, what rivers you usually take people out on and stuff like that. Give us a little information about your company.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. So I kind of bounce around a little bit all over as far as my own fishing goes, but as with the guiding, I really like the whole Merrimack drainage is great. It's close to home. It's quality fishery. So there's a variety of stretches of the Merrimack and the Big River that I like. And then the Gasconade, a little bit further drive. If you don't mind going out that far, I'm always happy to take people to the Gasconade if they're willing to drive that far. It's a really good river as well. And then, I do mostly float trips. I have like a drift boat style raft and then a jet boat. So we'll normally do full day floats. Occasionally we'll do half days too. And with my full days, I provide lunch on those, and all the gear. I provide all the gear and like drinks and snacks even on my half days too. And then I do $350 for my full days and $250 for my half days. And then in the wintertime or upon request, I do trout trips as well. It's just smallmouth is my absolute favorite. But when in those colder months, right now, like I have 2 trout trips this weekend coming up, where we're going to be fishing the Red Ribbon stretch. But we might get some smallies mixed in there too. And I love trout fishing also.
And what's the best website or contact information for you, Augie?
So my website is MissouriFlyLifeGuideCo.com. And then I have a Instagram page too, which is Missouri Fly Life Guide Co. And Instagram's a really good way. And then so is my website's good too. And then my email is augustusnickmeyer@gmail.com. That's my email address, and I'm normally, relatively quick with the email, depending on work and floating constraints.
By the way, we are very close to publishing a list of all the presenters and their contact information. We're working on that. Should be out soon. So he'll be included that. So, all right, Augie, good talking to you. Anybody else?
Augie, a question for Augie. Can you hear me? Question. Have you ever been exposed or fished a Castor River?
We have a stream cleanup down there every year with Missouri Smallmouth Alliance, but I've not been able to make that one yet. And I've actually never fished it, but I've heard good things.
Okay.
It's another kind of small stream that's in a remote area, so I would expect that it would probably fish pretty darn good. It's just that there's a lot of other ones close to home that have kept me distracted from going down there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right, Augie, it's been good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Augie.
Thank you all. Thank you guys.
Our next club event is the Chili Tie on March 26th, followed by the all-day event on the 2nd of April, and then a member meeting on the 28th of April. And we're looking hopefully to do something with Chris Chavetta out at Innsbruck, perhaps in May. So got to keep that in your mind. Good seeing everybody. Maybe next time in person, huh? Okay.
Hopefully. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Augie. It was really informative.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.